1973, when he was a political officer in the U.S. Embassy in Buenos Aires, Argentina. He later spent several years in Africa, first as the Deputy Chief of Missions in the U.S. Embassy in Malawi, where he assisted in the response to an influx of more than 500,000 Mozambican refugees. And then as the Deputy Chief of Mission in the U.S. Embassy in Liberia, where he was the second-ranking officer during the Liberian Civil War. For his service in Liberia during this tumultuous time, he received the State Department's Distinguished Honor Award for exceptional service, superb leadership, keen perception in the formulation and execution of U.S. foreign policy. Professor Jett then became a special assistant to the President and Senior Director for African Affairs at the National Security Council, where he was responsible for Africa policy during the first 6 months of the Clinton administration. He went on to serve as the U.S. Ambassador to Mozambique from 1993 to 1996, and to Peru from 1996 to 1999, where he helped bring about the successful conclusion of one of the world's largest peacekeeping operations, enabling the country to hold its first democratic elections. For his efforts, he received the American Foreign Service Award Association's Christian Herter Award. He was subsequently appointed U.S. Ambassador to Peru, where he managed the second largest aid program in Latin America and helped to open Peru's markets to U.S. companies. Professor Jett was the diplomat in residence at the Carter Center in Atlanta, Georgia from 1999 to 2000, through which he led election observation missions to Venezuela and Guatemala and conflict resolution efforts between Uganda and Sudan. He then joined the University of Florida in 2000, where he taught classes in globalization and foreign policy, as well as serving as Dean of the International Center. So as you see, as our last speaker, he comes with a lot of clout and about knowing about Africa. Welcome.
Thank you. Well, thank you all. Thank you, Elaine, for inviting me again. I thought the last time I spoke before one of her groups I would have done it, but I see that you asked me to talk again about a subject I care a lot about. I spent a total of 8 years in Africa. I consider myself partially African American. Not a widely accepted theory, but anybody who's been there and spent some time there can't help but come away affected by it. And it was uplifting at times and also very difficult at times when you're at the start of a civil war in a country and see it tear itself apart. It's a different kind of experience, a learning experience nonetheless. So I guess this is sort of like church. Sunday morning, the big sinners are in the front rows. So we'll try and move on quickly, though, get through the sermon and then get to your answers. And I'll let you ask the first question, because I always try and warn people that I'm about to wrap it up finally and turn it over to the question and answer period. But whenever I do, I always turn and say, okay, questions. It's like deer in the headlights sort of thing, blank stares and a little bit of awkward silence until somebody finally breaks the ice and asks the first question. So at the same time, you get the first question. Okay, so as was mentioned, my first tour was in Argentina. I think we're all the victims of our own experience in education. On the education side, even though I'm at Pitt, I'll put in a plug for Penn State. We have a master's degree program in international affairs. It's basically a 2-year program. You can get a master's degree in international stuff here at Pitt, obviously, but you might want to think about Penn State if you want to do something different. We have our own ice cream store on campus. And you can still get peachy paterno. So, I mean, what more do you want? But it's, I think we run a good program, and you certainly might consider it. Okay. So the other thing about Buenos Aires is this was 73 to 75, and it was, again, one of those unpleasant times when countries were bent on self-destruction. And so there was a very rampant phase of terrorism that was going on. I was there for 4 presidents, all of them civilian. If I'd gotten there a little bit earlier and a little bit later, like 2 months earlier and stayed about 6 months longer, I would have seen the transition from a military president to an elected president, to an elected president, another legitimate successor, to an elected president, and his successor, and then in March of '76 back to the military, because they came back after 4 civilian presidents. And they came back to nobody's surprise and nobody's regret, really, because of the terrorism problem. And there were 2 groups underground, the People's Revolutionary Army and the Montoneros, and they were busy assassinating military officers, policemen. And in response, the military came in and took over. And I always look out at my students and I always say things like, "You remember when?" And then I think, oh, you were in kindergarten then, so you don't remember when. But this is even further back. This is when disappeared, the word, which previously I think had been thought of as the form of a verb, disappeared, became a noun, meaning somebody who was grabbed by their government, probably tortured, usually murdered, and then the body never recovered. And so your loved ones then spent a great deal of time wondering what happened to you and wishing they could at least come to closure by being able to bury your remains. So March of '76, the military comes into power in Argentina, and then militaries, and I have nothing but respect for the American military. I am constantly amazed at the sacrifices they make today and the lack of sacrifice by any of the rest of us. If you remember when George Bush was asked what Americans could do to support the war in Iraq, he said, "Go shopping, stimulate the economy." Well, this is the 10th anniversary today of the Battle of Fallujah, and those 10 years ago, those Marines and Army fighting in the streets of Fallujah were thinking about going to the mall, I can assure you. So, that said though, the military tends to be a blunt instrument, particularly when it's not a particularly well-trained military or well-led or well-equipped. Ours is well-trained, well-led, well-equipped. But this was the Argentine military, and so their response to the terrorism problem was to take anybody that looked like a leftist, torture them, murder them, and throw them out of an airplane over the ocean. So they killed about anywhere between 9,000 and 12,000 people that way. You'll see estimates up to 30,000. In fact, that seems to be the common number cited in the newspapers, but I think a more accurate figure is 9,000 to 10,000. So that's how they dealt with the terrorism problem. And then in 82, they turned it back over to the civilians because they had the Falklands War. It's another thing that you don't remember. The Falklands are a collection of treeless, windswept islands in the middle of the South Atlantic that have 600,000 sheep and 1,800 people on them. I don't know about the sheep, but the 1,800 people are more British than the Queen, and they want no part of being Argentine. But this is the one cause that unified everybody. So they invaded the Malvinas, which is what they called them, and took over the islands. The British responded by throwing them off the island, and that sort of broke the back of the military government. They turned it over to the civilians, and elected president Raul Alfonsín took over. Before the military left, however, about 1982, the Reagan administration was beginning to train people to go help the Contras in Central America. They were a sort of anti-government group trying to overthrow the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. And so who did the Reagan administration to turn to train the Contras, the Argentine military? And they flew down there and offered them tens of millions of dollars to train these people. So here's a military that had just murdered 9,000 of its own citizens. So these were the knights in shining armor the Reagan administration chose to carry out our policies in Central America. So but the Reagan administration thought that the Sandinistas were a big threat because of the communists, that Central America, the distance from Brownsville, Texas to somewhere in Central America is not that far, therefore it's looked at as a threat, and so that was the justification. So often you see justifications for policy on those lines. Now, did Nicaragua really pose a threat to Brownsville? The other thing you should know about me is I grew up in New Mexico, so I've hated Texas for a very long time. And this was before Rick Perry, before George Bush, and so if the Nicaraguans had invaded and taken over Brownsville, I wouldn't have cared. But some people saw that as a threat. So anyhow, that's sort of the context of why maybe, and this is advice to all of you, to students, is that whenever you pick up a book or read an article, the first thing you should do is see who wrote it, what their background is, what their prejudices are, what spin they might be putting on it. Are they from a right-wing think tank in Washington or a left-wing think tank in Washington? And I can tell you something about what they say. So that's all introduction to perhaps understanding why it is I come to this problem the way I do. So let's talk specifically about one thing that I don't have to say you will remember, because presumably some of you read the newspapers and you've probably seen this. Boko Haram, the group in Nigeria that's running around kidnapping schoolgirls, turning them into sex slaves, basically, and committing all kinds of other atrocities, killing people, and generally being not very nice people. So they're an Islamist extremist group responsible for dozens of massacres of civilians in its 5-year insurgency. Its goals are to destabilize and ultimately overthrow the government and establish an Islamic caliphate, something that seems to be a popular enterprise these days, since that's what ISIS is trying to do in Iraq and Syria. It numbers in the hundreds to maybe a few thousand. Again, you get different estimates for the number from ISIS, but again, probably a few thousand, maybe as many as 20 or 30,000 at this point, with people presumably attracted to them from all over the world, including parts of Europe and even the United States. So how does Boko Haram fund itself? Bank robberies, extortion, kidnapping, no fast food franchises that I know of. So they basically criminal activity. So the question is it a threat? Well, the UN and the United States government says it poses an increasing menace to Western interests. President Goodluck Jonathan of Nigeria says it has global ambitions. So that's somewhat presumptuous for a terrorist group in Bush in Nigeria to number a couple thousand people, maybe, to have global ambitions. And there are reports of links to Al-Qaeda, of course, which is always sets off alarm bells in different places. According to the State Department, it shows no signs of ending its campaign against the government of Nigeria and the Western world. And so, no signs of ending its campaign because it's not really getting much pushback. And I suppose for a lot of, not a lot, for some people in Africa, if they get the choice between taking up an AK-47 or a hoe, and going to work in a field, they might find the AK-47 more attractive, especially if you can sort of hang the philosophy around that use of that weapon. So it's probably pretty easy to attract a certain number of adherents in a poor country. So what's Nigeria doing about it? President Jonathan is a Christian Southerner, and he basically is acting as if it's a northern Muslim problem that northern Muslims ought to be able to solve themselves. The Nigerian army has been indifferent, corrupt, and incompetent, and when it has done anything, it's often violated human rights because, like a lot of groups, Boko Haram doesn't go around in uniform, they don't go around with any ways of recognizing who they are. If they're carrying a weapon, it's obviously a tip-off. But mostly, they often will go into population centers to get food, and they'll just sort of blend in or attempt to blend in with the civilian population. So, a couple things that I learned in Liberia during the start of the Civil War there. I was there from 1989 to 91. The war started at about Christmas of 1989. And about, must have been June, July of 1990, a West African peacekeeping force landed in Liberia, in Monrovia, the port of the capital of Liberia, named after President James Monroe, because Liberia was founded by freed American slaves in the early 19th century. And then they proceeded to impose the only kind of society they knew, where they were the masters, and the local people who happened to just be living there were kind of the second-class citizens. And so from 1820s all the way to 1980, you had the country run by the 5% of the population that were Americo-Liberian. And the indigenous people were basically second-class citizens. Then in 1980, a sergeant, master sergeant named Samuel Doe, and 16 other sergeants and corporals jumped the wall of the presidential mansion and murdered the president in his pajamas. And then Doe took over, and then for the next 10 years attempted to fend off every challenge to his power. Then Charles Taylor launched the coup attempt that started in Christmas of 1989, and by the middle of 1990 had basically taken over about 95% of the country. So President Doe was reduced to being the president of about 8 square blocks of downtown Monrovia. And this West African peacekeeping force, there's something called ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, and they created a peacekeeping force comprised of principally of Nigerian troops. There was troops from Guinea, from Senegal, and a couple other countries I can't remember in West Africa. So they landed and they occupied the port of Monrovia and then didn't do much else. I don't think they even had a street map of downtown Monrovia. And so I think this was sent because the leader in Nigeria at the time was a dictator, military dictator named Babangida, and so he wanted to help out his fellow military dictator. And so Samuel Doe decided, well, I'll drive over to the port and visit these peacekeepers. So he jumps in his limousine and goes flying off in the caravan. And he gets to the port, and of course, when you move through a city in a caravan-like situation, you obviously attract a lot of attention. So there was Charles Taylor was one rebel leader. There was another guy named Prince Johnson, who was another rebel leader, used to have been a lieutenant of Taylor, but began to be perceived by Taylor as a threat, so Taylor tried to kill him, and Johnson took about 300 troops and went off and started his own revolution. So he controlled the area around the port. He saw Doe going into the port. Doe thought he was going to be protected by the peacekeepers. When British Johnson's people went and confronted the peacekeepers and Doe, the peacekeepers disappeared. They're there to keep the peace, and if there's no peace to keep, then they're out of there. And so they disappeared, and Johnson took Doe captive and interrogated him rather brutally, and basically he was wounded in the process. He went into shock and bled to death that night. If you were to see the interrogation, you can probably find it on YouTube, because there was a guy there who did a videotape of it, which became really popular in West Africa. So, two things I learned is that for a poorly led military organization, it's a lot easier for them to shoot civilians than it is to shoot people who have guns, because people who have guns may shoot back. And so there were checkpoints set up around this. It became very ethnic very quickly. There are about 8 major tribes in Liberia. And Doe was from the Kron tribe, or other tribes aligned with Taylor in Mejio and Amano in attempting to overthrow Doe. So you had a situation where they were setting up checkpoints, and they would ask people passing through on their way from one place to another what tribe you were from, and if you gave the wrong answer, then they took you to the side of the road and shot you. So undisciplined military forces tend to take out their anger on civilians, again, because they're easy targets. Thing two was the name of the West African Peacekeeping Force, the acronym was ECOMOG. It stood for, or was supposed to stand for, Economic Community of West, Economic Community Military Observer Group. But Liberians, being clever people, quickly figured out that what it actually stood for was every car or movable object gone, because the peacekeepers spent most of their time looting anything they could and loading up the supply ships that came up from Nigeria with stolen vehicles, stolen electronics, whatever they could load up on the ship and send back. And so, again, it was a demonstration that a poorly led military can have the opposite impact of what you want. So, in this case, we have Nigeria, a president who doesn't seem to care about the North because they're Muslim, and he's not. An army that, even though there's a certain amount, Nigeria produces a lot of oil, that's a lot of revenue, so there is money available for things like military expenditures, but you still seem to have a military that's indifferent, corrupt, and incompetent, and when it does do something, it often violates human rights. So the challenge would be the fact that Boko Haram can, as long as it can sustain itself through robberies, extortion, kidnapping, whatever, and there are lots of different ways that enterprising rebel groups in Africa can generate revenue, if you will. In Angola, we had a civil war that raged for a very long time, and it continued because the rebel leader, Jonas Savimbi, got about $500 million worth of diamonds every year from the territory he controlled, and the government got about $3 or $4 billion from the oil it exported. So unlike Mozambique, which was also a former Portuguese colony, which also had a civil war, that war ended a lot sooner than the war in Angola. And while I would like to take credit for ending the war in Mozambique, actually it ended before I got there, and so the challenge was to have the first election. And that was a challenge, but it was made easy by the fact that the principal resources in Mozambique were shrimp and cashews, which make a nice stew, but they don't generate the kind of money that you can use to sustain a civil war. So Angola had the money to waged the war and the incentive to do it because of the money. The neighboring states also wanted to be involved to get a piece of the action. And so it continued a lot longer than it did in Mozambique. So in Nigeria, they have the oil, and but it seems there was a Tom Friedman, the New York Times columnist, wrote a column once about how as oil prices go up, the level of democracy in oil exporting countries goes down, presumably with the exception of Norway, but for other oil exporters, it gave the government money to buy off certain sectors of the society and to ensure that they stayed in power. And I suppose that's probably what's happening in Nigeria. They're more interested in allocating the oil money among the elite than they are about worrying about an insurgency in the north. So it's also a very large area. It remains inaccessible because it has bad roads, lousy phone reception, lousy infrastructure in general. And the government has not pursued a comprehensive anti-insurgency problem and has done very little to address the pervasive sense of alienation among people in the north. And so while as horrific as Boko Haram sounds, it probably has a lot of support in the north because they have a government in the south that really doesn't care about them and makes that evident in a number of different ways. And so one of the things they've done, and there was an article in the New York Times a couple days ago about civilian joint task forces. These are basically vigilantes that have formed on their own to protect their communities. And but they're being somewhat informal, you might say. They were also accused of violating human rights. So there was an article, we'll remember Robert Gates. He was the Secretary of Defense that made the transition from the Bush administration to the Obama administration. And then he wrote a book about how Obama didn't listen to his advice and things would be better in the world if he had. That seems to be a cottage industry in Washington, writing books about how if Obama had listened to my advice, things would be great. Leon Panetta has now done it. His Gates' successor at Defense. So I'm always amazed at the records of conversations and meetings that were top secret and hardly given any distribution now become fodder for these memoirs, these sort of kiss-and-tell memoirs that seem to be part of the culture of Washington these days. So one of the other things that Robert Gates wrote was an article in Foreign Affairs. I don't know if you read Foreign Affairs. There's something called the Council on Foreign Relations. Council on Foreign Relations is one of those evil institutions bent on imposing world government. It operates a fleet of black helicopters that don't show up on radar, and mostly fly around places like Idaho and swoop down and carry off women and livestock and strip all your guns if you're not vigilant. So seriously, the Council on Foreign Relations is kind of a think tank. It was started in the 1920s. It's basically the voice of the establishment. It has probably 6,000 members, and 2,000 who live in Manhattan and think they're smarter than everybody else, 2,000 that live inside the Beltway around Washington and know they're smarter than everybody else, and then 2,000 in the rest of the country, including me. So they put out something called Foreign Affairs. It's this sort of gray, it's not really a journal, it's not a magazine. You know it's not a journal because the articles are actually readable and don't contain a lot of math. So it's essentially the establishment point of view when it comes to foreign policy. I mean, they have a staff who grind out these articles. The 6,000 members are mostly just for revenue generation and decorations, really. But their staff tends, with one notable exception, at least, tends to be fairly balanced and objective. So, in this publication of Foreign Affairs, Gates wrote this article back in May 2010, which he said the biggest threat to the United States is international terrorism launched from failing states. And the way to deal with it is to go around the world, particularly in places like Africa, and train the militaries of these failing states. So I've only got two problems with that. One, that's not the threat, and two, the solution will make it worse, not better. Aside from that, it was really not good. It's not the threat because these failing states typically do not produce the kind of international terrorism that is a threat to the United States, because these failing states are such a disaster that even terrorists can't use them effectively as a basis to launch attacks, certainly not on the United States. And the other thing that I think is important, I think whenever you're assessing a threat, you've got to deal with the probability that it's going to affect you, right? So, Ebola. Here's a trick question for you. How many causes of death in the United States have caused more death than Ebola in the United States?
Almost all of them.
Yeah, right, there you go. My trick question didn't stump you. All of them, because exactly how many people have died from Ebola in the United States? And if you had less than one as a cause of death, it wouldn't be a cause of death if it's caused no death. So I think everything else, the 30,000 people that die in auto accidents. There was a thing on NPR today about esophageal cancers going to kill, I don't know how many thousands of people, 15,000, something like that. As you leave here, don't cross the street because 600, 700 people are run over as pedestrians. Don't get in a car because 30,000 people die in auto accidents. And when you get home, stay away from your furniture because about 20 Americans die every year from their furniture falling on them, which is about as many as die from terrorism. So what's the big deal here? Why are we scared of terrorism? Because 9/11, I think, traumatized all of us, even some of you who don't remember it, or were in kindergarten when it happened. But the actual threat, probability that you'll be a victim of Ebola or terrorism is so ridiculously low that it doesn't really warrant the kind of policies that you seem to be imposing. So anyhow, back to failing states, let's see if this works. Yeah, it does. So this is a nifty map. This is something put out called the Failed States Index. And you can see the darker red the color, the more likely it is, I guess I can make this bigger, that the state is failing. I guess the most stable states are Canada, but that's because it's boring and nothing happens up there. And they drink Molson. I mean, that's inexplicable, but I understand they don't want to be American. That's okay. I mean, they want to keep repeating that mistake. That's all right. Australia, again, boring. I guess yellow means the United States is reasonably stable, but you can see, as I said, that the darker the color in the red-orange range, the more likely it is to be a failed state. And this index rates it has a little score, an annual report, and it rates every country. So, okay, all these states are in danger. All right, now let's look at something called Freedom House. Freedom House is a nonprofit And they do another annual report, an annual ranking, and they rank the world in terms of freedom, press freedoms, human rights, civil freedoms, that sort of thing. So again, the green color means, I guess, that's okay, or boring maybe. Those are the countries that are rated as free. They sort of lump the world. They again do a ranking and a score, and they rank the world into three categories: free, partially free, and not free. So the green is free. The yellow is partially free. I guess Mexico is partly free. What else? Hover over country: Venezuela, Colombia. So you can see Russia, surprise, surprise, not free. And you get a freedom ranking, freedom rating, political rights rating, and civil liberties rating. And that gives you your composite score for your freedom. So you can see that the blue colors are the problematic countries that are considered not free in terms of their political rights and civil rights. So again, you can see this wide swath. I mean, Russia's a big country, so it's this big blue splotch. China's a big country, so it's another big blue splotch. But then all of these sub-Saharan countries, sub-Saharan Africa, are again not free. So they're potentially failing, but they're not free. And they're also, one more map, there's something called Transparency International, and they do a corruption perception index. And so again, you can see that I guess orange is a popular color for showing bad situation. You've got the scale here at the bottom from highly corrupt, really dark colors, to kind of yellow, which is very clean. And again, this is perceptions. They do public opinion surveys in these countries, and these are the opinion of the people in that country, of their own government, their own society, as to how corrupt it is. And so, I guess Canada's less corrupt than the United States. We're 19th out of 177 countries. Canada is 9th. I guess it's so boring up there that they can't even bother to be corrupt. But Australia, again, 9th, I guess, is tied on the boring index with Canada. But again, you can see that the worst, the most corrupt, the darkest colors are places in Sub-Saharan Africa, and then, of course, a little in Central Asia and in the Middle East as well. So what does all that mean? Well, if you're going to go around the world worried about a failing state causing a threat to the United States, and the solution is to strengthen their military, you're strengthening the military of the countries that are the most corrupt and repressive in the world. And so those militaries are not going to be used, as they're not used in Nigeria, to fight real threats to security. They're going to be used to keep the regime in power, so those people can continue to loot whatever resources that country has. So what's changed? Well, I found one speech given in 1995 by somebody at the Pentagon, and they said, ultimately, we see very little traditional strategic interest in Africa. And so, what's changed? The Clinton administration, it came out with a plan for Africa. It was mentioned, I was on the National Security Council for the first 6 months of the Clinton administration, and back then there was the mantra for the campaign was, it's the economy, stupid. We had to do something about the domestic economy. And the flip side of that was nothing else matters. And so something like Africa not only didn't have anything to do with the economy, but it wasn't even very important in the sort of scheme of things in terms of foreign policy interest. The other thing presidents like to do is, they always promise change, right? I mean, hope and change, or fear and change, or small change, or whatever. And so one of the things that Clinton did is, I'm not going to have these fancy state dinners with black tie and formal meals at the White House with visiting dignitaries. I'm a regular guy, and I'm not going to do that. I mean, Jimmy Carter did the same thing. Jimmy Carter was carrying his own suitcase on the Air Force One and all this sort of stuff to give the image that he's sort of a regular person. So the result was that we could hardly get Africa discussed, let alone a African leader invited. And so after about 6 months, we decided, well, we don't want to ignore Africa completely. So, okay, let's invite somebody to the White House. Okay, who will it be? And so we sort of went through the list of African Democrats, and there are a few more now than there were then, but it was a pretty short list then. And so we settled on Sam Nujoma, who is the president of Namibia. And, well, we're not going to have a black tie dinner, so what are we going to do for him? Oh, we'll give him breakfast. So literally, we had the first African leader in the Clinton White House was given, I guess, bacon and eggs. So that was his, but he was thrilled to be there nonetheless, to be the first. So anyhow, finally at some point the Clinton administration got around to saying, this is our policy with regard to Africa. We're going to promote peace, provide humanitarian assistance, foster democracy, and support growth and development. Well, the Obama administration has come out with its policy for Africa, and you can find all of this stuff online. They're going to strengthen democracy, spur growth, advance peace, and promote development. Well, it's like sort of reshuffle the words and the same old stuff. Because some of the problems are, in fact, not that much different. So what's really changed? I think 9/11 sort of paralyzed our minds, and we were led off to a war that was unnecessary. But George Jr. got to attempt to prove that George Jr.'s low opinion of him was wrong. In the process, confirming that in fact he was right. But anyhow, 9/11 was I think what changed on 9/11 is that 99% of Americans thought terrorism was something that happened over there to somebody else. And then all of a sudden, oh my God, OMG, it can happen here to me today. And so they basically gave a blank check to Washington to do something about it. The other excuse for getting involved in Africa is China's buying up all its resources. We have to worry about China because I'm not worried about China. I mean, if we wanted to damage China, all we have to do is shut down Walmart. Every damn thing in Walmart is made in China. At least up in, I haven't found that the fresh vegetables are coming from China yet, but I haven't really looked at the origin. But everything else that you look at has made in China label. So I think those kind of trade relationships are going to be stronger than even traditional political rivalry can overcome. So another problem with Africa, piracy, seems to be a little bit less. Ebola, the famous cause of death, it just happens to be less than every other cause of death. Maybe investment. And Africa, you remember the Iraq War was such a fantastic success because it was conducted by a guy named Donald Rumsfeld, who thought, we're in there, defeat the bad guys, turn it over to Mr. Chalabi, our favorite Iraqi exile, and then we're out of there in 6 months, and therefore we don't have to do any planning for what happens after that. So it kind of didn't work out that way, and but that's another story. One of the other innovations of Mr. Rumsfeld was to create something called Afrikaans. The military likes to have everything very orderly, and so they divide up the world into various commands, and they put a 4-star general in charge, the 4-star general being the highest rank one achieves in the military. And so Africa used to be divided up between the Pacific Command, which was an admiral, a European Command, and the Central Command. And so that map making didn't appeal to Mr. Rumsfeld, I guess. And so he said, okay, we're going to set up our own little command for Africa. But that means a 4-star general in charge of the American military programs in the region. The problem is 4-star generals don't just come by themselves, driving up and in a car and get out and carry out their programs. They come with an enormous administrative tail, you might say. They have the little colonel with a gold braid on his shoulder, carrying the general's briefcase and all this other stuff. And so they have lots of programs and things that they share. So what does Afrikaans say it does? It's in concert with interagency and international partners, builds defense capability, responds to crisis, and deters and defeats transnational threats in order to advance U.S. interests and promote regional security, stability, et cetera, which sounds innocuous enough, but what does it really mean? Well, something else that none of you will remember is there was a woman named Jean Kirkpatrick who was the UN ambassador of President Reagan, and she, her name was applied to something called the Kirkpatrick Doctrine, which basically said, we'll get in bed with any right-wing dictator because they're our friends in the struggle against communism, and we don't like left-wing leaders, even Democrats, even freely elected, because they're leftist and they might be more friendly to the commies than to us. And so we helped overthrow Mr. Allende in Chile and replaced him with a military dictator, Mr. Pinochet, and things like that. And so that was the policy. Now, you won't hear it enunciated in that way, but basically we seem to be getting into the there's always kind of a trade-off sometimes, not always, there's frequently a trade-off between those values you say you stand up for, like human rights and democracy, and then Bahrain, for instance. We say, okay, we should see less repression in Bahrain, but oops, we have a fleet that's based there. So we kind of soft pedal the repression in Bahrain because we need some place to park our ships. So this is the kind of thing that I think we've evolved into because of our fear of terrorism. Back in May, President Obama announced a new terrorism partnership fund. He said, I'm going to spend $5 billion. This was something that was kind of thrown into a speech because when presidents give speeches, they have to announce something. It can't be this sort of all platitudes. And so nobody had ever heard of this fund before. Basically, nothing has happened about it, but I bring it up because if the president had said, I'm going to spend $5 billion promoting democracy in Africa, then people would have probably said, oh, what are you going to do that for? If you go around and you ask Americans what government program they would like to cut to help balance the budget, we have this awful deficit that we have to worry about. There's no program except one that will get a majority of Americans saying it should be cut. Every other program, a majority of Americans want to keep it intact, whatever it is. So the one program that most Americans want to cut?
Foreign aid.
Foreign aid, right. Because they think foreign aid is how much of the budget? If you ask them, they will say, oh, it's 15, 20% of the federal budget. Mm-hmm. Right. If you ask them how much it should be, they will say, oh, about 10% of the budget. And as you just said, it's actually less than 1% of the budget. So if you said spend $5 billion on democracy or development, then people would have reacted, but it's $5 billion because it's got terrorism. Nobody seems to notice. And then you have arguments like ground forces are necessary to ultimately defeat the ISIS terror network. Again, this seems to be the argument is not directly related to Africa, but it's they don't seem to get it. Let's see if I got it here. No. All right, I'll get back to that in a second. And there was something called the School of the Americas. Anybody ever heard of that? Yeah. Okay. So it was a training program for Latin American militaries, and it trained brought Latin American militaries to Georgia and gave them various courses. And then these Latin American military officers would go home and abuse their citizens in some cases, like the Argentine military did with its civilians, or with its suspected terrorists. And so there's a lot of criticism, and I think there used to be, I don't know if there still is, every November there would be a big demonstration outside of Fort Benning in Columbus, Georgia, against the School of the Americas, close the School of the Americas. So what did the military do? It changed the name of the School of the Americas to the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation, and it incorporated human rights training in all its courses. So you'd have a 2-week course and you get a 2-hour lecture on human rights. And then the people would go back and into the societies from which they came, and often they would forget the lecture on human rights. Okay, case in point, we have Burkina Faso, which is, if you've been reading the newspapers in the news, they just had a president, Mr. Compaoré, who's only been in power for 27 years. He wanted to change the constitution to let him stay in power longer. The people were so fed up with him that they rioted, and the military stepped in. Compaoré packed up his bags, and out of it filled with money he hadn't already salted away in his Swiss bank account. And so he left the country, the military took over, and now the question is the military going to give it back? The African Union, which is the organization of African countries, has said, we want the civilians to get the government back within 2 weeks. So this is just a question from the noon press briefing. For those who are really foreign policy junkies, you can subscribe to the noon briefing. It happens every day in the State Department, and you can either get a transcript of the session, or you can actually watch the video. And there's this sort of game that gets played where the journalists like to put the department spokesperson into embarrassing situations by asking them embarrassing questions. And so this one was, what about Burkina Faso? Do we agree that it should go back to civilian rule within 2 weeks, and are we going to do anything about it? And she says, well, we certainly have been, as you know, ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States. And the African Union and the UN had the lead on this, and we've been working closely with them, and we certainly support their call for a 2-week plan. We thought this was viable, but also productive, et cetera, and we're going to follow the lead of ECOWAS and the African Union. And this is something that probably could have been leapt upon if they could find Africa by the critics of the president, who always says he's following from behind, in the case of Libya, I think it was. So anyhow, here's an article. Comes up, guess what? This is from the Afrikaans, United States Africa Command, and talking about all this great counterterrorism training that we were given the army of Burkina Faso, and we spent a week telling them how to make decisions, and then another week showing them which end of their rifle to point at the enemy and how to squeeze the trigger. So I think we're going to get into the situation we probably already are of training these forces. And a couple more slides here. I'm probably running out of time. So what's the solution? Well, we have, as you read in some of the reference material, there are 242 million Muslims in Sub-Saharan Africa, and there are a lot more now, and there will be 386 million not too long from now. So I think whatever we do, we should probably try not to alienate those people. What isn't the solution? Well, this is a quote. Iraq's security forces are developing steadily, and they are in the fight. Momentum has gathered in recent months with strong Iraqi leaders out front, and with continued coalition support, this trend will continue. Anybody know who said that? Or when? Probably not. So if you read the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, you would have read my article where I quoted this.
Oh, Petraeus. About Petraeus?
Yes.
Yes.
It was by the General David Petraeus, the four-star general who was in charge of training the Iraqi military, and he made the statement back in September 2004 about how swell it was going. Not only was there a light at the end of the tunnel, there was no tunnel. And that was 10 years ago, and yet we're having the same discussion today about, maybe we need to train the Iraqi forces because they only outnumber ISIS by 20 to 1. There are 20 times as many Iraqi security forces as there are ISIS members, and yet these people won't stand and fight. And so if we train them for the next 10 or 15 years, then they'll stand and fight. Well, you can't train somebody to fight for a regime that they don't respect. This is an example from Libya. The agenda in Libya lacks a political strategy. If experience elsewhere is an indication it will take 5 to 15 years to train the army, et cetera, et cetera. So, the idea of training the army as the solution to the problem isn't a solution to the problem. But it does solve some problems. General Petraeus, and you would have had a chance to go here and talk about how they won the war in Iraq a couple weeks ago when he spoke here in Pittsburgh. General Petraeus wrote that in September 2004. What happened 6 weeks later? There was an election, right? And George Bush, after an accomplishment-free first term, was reelected. And a couple of years later, General Petraeus got his 4th star. So there's a big mission accomplished banner, which I think they probably got out of the basement and ran out because at least some objectives were attained. So what could be done? Well, basically, you could give more power to the embassy, more power to the ambassador, more ability to move resources around to address the problem a little bit more broadly than just training military to fail to fight. And this happened in Liberia. We spent a lot of money during the 1980s training Samuel Doe's military. And in the end, they didn't stand and fight either. And as I said, within a couple months, he was the president of 8 square blocks of downtown Monrovia. So, not to end on a happy note, because if you want optimism, my speaking fees are high. So, why won't it happen? And this is the last slide, so get ready. Because of the way Washington works, because of bureaucratic turf, because of budget control, because of the gotcha politics, and we now have John McCain in charge of the Armed Services Committee. And so there will undoubtedly be no situation for which he doesn't have a military solution. And then there seems to be plenty of money for guns because of our fear of terrorism, but not any for butter. That being the classic analogy between spending on social programs and spending on military programs. In this case, butter being supporting democracy and empowering the institutions, and particularly the civil society in these states that are on the verge of failing. And so that's what we ought to do, but that's not easy either, because you can teach somebody how to point a rifle at the supposed enemy, but it's more difficult to teach a judge to be able to render justice. But I think in the long run, it's a lot more potentially successful solution than what we've been trying and what we continue to try, and we'll probably continue to try in the future, even though I have no optimism that it's going to work any more successfully in Africa than it could be wrong. With that, how much time do we have left? We run out of time?
15 minutes for Q&A.
15 minutes, okay, go ahead.